I like the idea of two-parters because they've got more time to tell the story. That's one of the reasons I like docuseries over documentaries or television series over movies. Is you've got more time to develop characters and develop story and stuff.
Yeah, it was something that you mentioned after we read number 27 at the very last panel of the first Batman story. They say, they tell you that Bruce Wayne is Batman, even though they hadn't done it throughout the rest of the panels. And you were like, man, I wish they had drawn that out. And I think at this time, the assumption is that like you're buying stuff off the newsstand and there's no guarantee, right? Like no one has a subscription to Batman, right? That you're going to be able to read both issues of a story. And so they really avoid continuity in a big way for a long time. Even in these two-parters, they make, sort of intentionally have things wrap up. So like Julie at the end of this is no longer in danger. He rescues her. And like, yeah, he's going to follow the monk to Hungary, but that sort of like imminent threat is gone. He's just like going after the bad guy. Right. So, Stan Lee, his ethos kind of famously, he said that like every comic is someone's first comic. And so they would often in sort of, the 60s during all sort of the boom of Marvel comics, they would repeat things over and over and over again. They would explain people's origin story. They would explain people's powers. They would, it was very, very verbose in that way. And that's just following out of like the Golden Age. They're doing a lot of that same sort of thing. So it is exciting to see some semblance of like continuity of an ongoing story sort of being introduced.
Definitely. Well, and it is kind of interesting. As you're talking, I was thinking about how they had those, I don't remember what they were called, but they had those books that would release like one page of the newspaper at a time. And like there were these writers who were famous for just being extremely verbose and descriptive of the rooms and stuff. So that they could, one, like get more time to develop their story between issues, but also sell more because they got paid by the page or whatever. So they'd make more money by just like drawing it out. That was obviously like books in general were a developed concept, and then like inserting them into the newspaper was like a newer thing so that you could have this like serial story. And so comic books, like being in their infancy at this point, don't have that same type of luxury to assume that you can have readers return week after week serially to develop on the previous story. So like this is probably a pretty fresh concept of continuity in general for comics, right?
There are recurring comic strips that show up in newspapers that tell a story over time. Like, I think we even talked about that Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson had done an adaptation of Swiss Family Robinson that was appearing in newspapers over and over and over again. Because someone might have a subscription to a newspaper, and because they, the color comics were only coming on the weekends, right? Like the Sunday funnies. Right. It was more reasonable for someone to assume that someone's reading every single iteration of a comic because, they get the same newspaper every Sunday. Whereas, like, a comic book is more disposable, right? Like, it's on newsstands. You're just happening to pick it up. Whereas, it does become the case that eventually people become diehard fans, right? And the sort of hobby store crops up, right? A comic book store crops up, and people are going to places that are not just the newsstand to get their books. That is kind of one of the most defining characteristics of comic books in the modern era is the continuity, right? The fact that they all tie into each other and they have, crossovers and sort of like events that impact, future stories and things like that. But it doesn't happen a ton here at first.
Right. And so I think based on Detective Comics 27 coming out when it did, it makes perfect sense for them to introduce the character and reveal the alter ego in the same issue at the time. But if they were like developing Batman from scratch today and no one had ever heard of Batman, they probably would have drawn it.
Yeah, one of my favorite comic books ever is Ultimate Spider-Man, which is was a alternate universe that they created. Basically, in the early 2000s, they were like, there's too much continuity, right? No one has read Spider-Man since the 60s, and especially if you're trying to get to a kid, right? They don't know all of these stories that have happened. So they relaunched everything, and they made a new Earth, right? It was a new universe, a parallel track. It was the Ultimate Universe, right? And a lot of it was retellings, right? So they would take a story that happened in the 80s, and they would do it again with a modern spin, where like the kids are in a high school in the 2000s or whatever. And it's kind of famous that like the first issue of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy 15 is like, 12 pages or something like that. And it does all of it, right? He does the sort of wrestling match and like makes the costume and like gets bitten by the spider and Uncle Ben dies and like all of those things happen right in one issue in like 12 pages.
It covers a ton of ground,
which is like, ends up as like a 2-hour movie for Sam Raimi, or in Ultimate Spider-Man is like 6 issues, right? It's literally a trade paperback that, and they make it last forever. He stays in high school for a very short period of time. In Ultimate Comics, like he's in high school the whole series, right? Like the sort of like methodology of storytelling has changed significantly. People call it, I don't like this term, but there's this sort of derogatory way that they talk about modern comics of decompression, where like back in the day, right? Because they had to tell a complete story in however many pages, like they had to pack a lot of stuff in, right? And so you read the story we just did, and like Batman's in New York and he's like rescuing a person and his wife is hypnotized and she's going on a boat and like he's fighting the monk on a boat and then he's fighting the monk in Paris and then they're going to Hungary, right? Like tons of stuff is happening. And they're like, well, now people are writing to the trade and there's decompression and like nothing happens. Like they're unhappy that there's less storytelling, right? But to me, which makes sense, right? Like if you're paying like $4 an issue or whatever, and like there's one action sequence in the entire thing, like people get upset that they're paying a lot for not a lot of story. But like to me, what's exciting about that is you get more time to sort of sit with a character and like understand their motivation and understand their personality. And it's not just like A happens, then B happens, then C happens, right? Like you get to have this sort of like cerebral conversation about like, what is the relationship between, Batman and his villains, and he's putting them away in the asylum, and like how do they feel about that? And like, why, it's their cyclical nature. It's like, there's introspection and metatextual sort of like, content that ends up in these books. But
it reminds me of this interview that I saw with, I think it was Hugh Jackman, and they were talking about Logan, the X-Men movie, and how excited they were when 20th Century Fox approved a rated R film, because the writing changed a whole bunch. They were kind of hamstrung by doing PG-13 because it has to happen at a certain pace for the attention span of a 13-year-old to keep up, because that's going to be like your biggest target market is like the teens and the young adults and stuff. When they got the R rating approval, they totally changed the story because they could be slower. They could draw things out. They could do a lot more character development. They could talk about much more mature concepts and motivations of the character. And the story is definitely my favorite X-Men movie is Logan because of the pace and how much more complex the characters are and stuff. And so like I think about that in writing and movies a lot, of like Steven Spielberg is a good example where a lot of his movies aren't about what you think they're about. Like Jurassic Park isn't about dinosaurs. It's really about the character development between Dr. Grant and these two kids, Dr. Grant not liking kids at the beginning and these kids not having a father due to a divorce, and so they like bond with each other. So the whole movie is really about like this complicated string of character development that I really enjoy, and I like slower movies because they do a lot more of that character development. So this like decompression thing, I think I would appreciate a lot because of the character development. I don't have a 13-year-old attention span either. So I understand like if it's aimed at kids, maybe kids won't.
Well, and you're also not going to the comic book store every week to pay $4 for the next 10, or 20 pages of a story, right? If you're reading a comic book at all, which I assume you're not doing very often, you're going to buy a book where it's already done, right? And everything's all together, and you can appreciate it as one unit. So
yeah, and I do that with podcasts frequently. If I know that they're doing a season that's serially, I'll wait until they have all the episodes out and like season 4 starts to roll or something, and then I can binge the whole thing.
Yeah.